Georgetta Gankars here. I want to kind of go over a little bit about the mediums used in oil painting. I know some students we have covered them in the materials list in my class, but I would still like to go over them a little bit more in detail. Especially if students want to change, like from acrylics, and they want to try oils. There are a couple of things that you should know. So first of all, the first thing that you need to know about oil painting is it's a different medium, of course, than acrylics and watercolors. And one of the reasons why it's so different is it takes the paint a long time to dry. So with watercolors, they're kind of fast drying, and acrylics, they're fast drying. But oils can take up to 6 months to a year to dry, depending on how much paint you put on the canvas. And that's important that you know that. So the mixing process is different, and the solvents that you use with the oils are different. With oils, you cannot use water. There are water-soluble oils. That's another thing. I'll go into that in another video. But when we're talking about oils, you have to mix solvents with them. And the solvents that you need are quite different than if you were using just, regular water for acrylics and watercolors. The next thing is the color. Acrylics have really kind of stepped it up in the last couple of decades, where you can have beautiful varnishes with acrylics and they can almost look like oils. But oils, they have that romance to them, that they've been around for centuries. So people like working with them, especially a lot of old masters. When you go to the museums, a lot of the famous paintings that you'll see, especially like in the Renaissance, they were oil, that they were using oil-based paintings with oil. So a lot of people like oils for different reasons. They're also considered very classical. So knowing that kind of background, you have to ask yourself, do you have the proper space to paint with the oils? Because the other thing about oil paints are they have a tiny bit of a smell. Now, if you're really sensitive, you might notice it. Now, as time has progressed, a lot of the paints are not as, how can I say, toxic. And they have like odorless thinners. But you still have to have proper ventilation, because it might be odorless to you, but you're still breathing in the solvents. So that's a studio space with, sometimes if I'm painting plein air and I'm painting outside, I don't notice the smell, but sometimes I will notice it in the studio. And you also have to think about disposal of your materials. You can't just throw them, the rags that are filled with linseed oil in the garbage. They can be flammable. So there's ways that you have to kind of, like if you're painting with oil paintings, I have a drum where I can put this stuff and close it, and you have to find out where you can dispose of the paints, because you can't throw flammable materials into the regular trash can. So knowing those things, that would be an issue for you to think of if you could paint with oil paints. So the other thing is, I want to start going over now the idea of things that you would have to think of when you're using oils and not acrylics. So the first one is fat over lean. And what does that mean? It means that when you're painting, if you think of it this way, the top layer is a lot fatter than the bottom layer. So when I'm starting my painting and we're blocking out, when we're blocking out the shapes. So when we started painting, for an example, in the studio, and I would show you, we're going to, start this painting of this landscape or whatever, and we're doing what we call kind of blocking out. So if you remember, we're starting like this. You see, I don't have a lot of paint here. I see kind of all of my lighter areas, my medium tones and dark, and then I move here and then I move here. Well, here I would just be using, and that's what I call, my blocking out area. I would be using more turpentine and less oil, linseed oil, because it would dry a little bit faster. And then as I move to the next level, it would be a little bit fattier, and maybe I would be using a little bit more linseed oil, equal amounts of linseed oil and terp, and then on the top layer it would be more linseed oil and less terp. Okay, so, when you're progressing from here, like stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3, the painting, of course, on the top would be fatter. And the reason why is you want the painting to dry underneath, because if you don't and you put too much paint on top of the painting, when it's not dry, it's going to crack, because the paint underneath is still kind of doing its dance and moving, and you're putting something on top. Now, they do sell mediums that are that help paintings dry faster, but you have to know like the proportion of how to add that medium, and they sell them separately in bottles, and I'll go into that. So the first thing is Phytovoline, like we just spoke about, and my rule is I usually have 1 part medium to 3 parts paint. So say for an example, you were in stage, I don't know, 1 of, blocking out your colors. You see here? So basically, if I was mixing my own terp and linseed oil at home, I'd have, 2 parts turpentine and 1 part linseed oil, and then I would add 3 part paints to that solvent. So it's kind of like a 3-to-1 ratio, if you remember that, to your solvent. And the other thing is I make my own solvents at home. I use Stan oil. I really like the Stan oil. And Stan oil, of course, is the linseed oil. It's been heated. It's just treated. It's heat treated linseed oil. That's all it is. And it's better than the refined oil, because the problem with the refined oil is the refined oil actually yellows. Sometimes if you look at like tea white, your titanium white, and you look at it and you're like, oh wow, after a while, when I was painting, this started yellowing. It's because the refined oil is yellow. Now you'd have to use a lot, right, of it, but the refined oils are also a lot cheaper, inexpensive. Now the other thing I want to talk to you is extenders. They have ways that you can extend your paint. Like with acrylic paints, we might add a gel medium. Well, with oil paints, you can add an oleo gel, and that's like a linseed and a silica together, and it extends the paint. They also have fast drying mediums. Now the fast drying mediums are the way to go, because it's like an alkyne resin, and the one that I like is by Winsor Newton, and it's called Liquin. And it's the best one because you can mix it with the oil paints. It doesn't yellow. And so in other words, that's all you need, because it has everything in there. It thins the paint, like acrylics would work with the water as the solvent. And it also, which terpenoid does, and it also is like a linseed oil, because it makes your brush go across the canvas really easily, and that's what you need. That's why you're using the linseed oil. Otherwise, it would be really hard for your brush to drag across the canvas. So the alkyne resin that I recommend, again, is by Winsor Newton, and that's it. You'll see that it's a fast drying medium. You can work really well. You can work in layers. Now, you don't really need to add anything else to the Liquin. You can paint with the alkyne, resin called Liquin, but they have other things, like Liquin has like a gel for impasto, for heavy strokes, that you can just work with and add directly to your oils. They even have this one that's really cool. It's like for refined strokes. So I would use that one if I was going to, if I was at the, I'm doing some highlights here or something, that's where I might use that refined gel. Or if you're like more like an impressionist painter, you might decide that you're just going to buy the impasto, and that would be fine for you. So those are some things that that I want you to know about as far as oils. The other thing are, they have, if you want to mix your own oils, you can buy gum turpentine. That's what I do. And it's kind of like, it's artist kind of distilled turpentine. And what I do is I mix it with Stan oil, and then I make my own solvent. And I can say, okay, I want to put more terp here, for thinner washes, for blocking out, or maybe I'm going to add, more Stan oil to it for modeling, and then the top layer is really more Stan oil for details. And I like having that control, so I like mixing my paints, my solvents myself. The last thing is varnishes. So you'll see all these varnishes, they come in spray cans, or they come in a little jar where you can kind of just open them up with the brush and paint them on. So the thing is, you really have to have a proper brush, and I talked a little bit about that to you in the video when we did the washes. But a wash brush is fine, a mop brush is fine. You know, you can use a half brush as long as it's wide. If you're doing these varnishes, depending on the size of your painting, sometimes you might have to varnish your painting on an easel if it's really large. Usually I varnish it on a flat surface that's kind of even, and I take off all the dust on the painting, and then I start the varnish. The thing about oil paintings, and when you're varnishing, you have to wait at least 6 months to a year or more before you start putting those varnishes on top of the painting. Now, sometimes artists do mix the varnish when they're mixing with the oil paints, like a Dharma varnish, and that's fine. I don't really do that. What I do is I wait till the painting dries, and then I will varnish it. Now, because it takes such a long time for the painting to dry, say for an example, you had, I don't know, an art exhibition, and it was, 3 months from now, and you're like, I can't wait 6 months for my painting to dry, or a year. Then what you could do is you could buy a varnish, and they sell different types of varnishes for the oil paints that, how can I say, that will make the paint that you can put on the painting right away. So you still have to wait for the painting to dry, but you don't have to wait like 6 months to a year. And that's when I use a retouch varnish. So if you go into the art store, you'll see retouch varnishers for oils. That works great, and you can put it on top, and then when that's dry, you can varnish again, with a regular varnish. But the retouch varnish is the one that, say you have a show tomorrow, not tomorrow, but in a couple of months, you can use that one. And I talked a little bit about the brushes for that. Again, I would use a mop brush or a half brush for the varnish because it has to be large. Sometimes students will use the synthetic, depending on, you have to go over the painting very lightly with a small amount of varnish, not a lot. The spray varnishes are good if you have a textured canvas, because if you have a lot of texture on the canvas, you're going to have trouble dragging the brush across, when you're doing the varnish, and you're not going to catch all the areas. So that's when I use a spray varnish. And there's another kind of varnish, there's a Dharma varnish, and it comes in gloss, or it comes like in a gloss or a kind of finish. But the only thing that I've seen with the Dharma varnish is it does darken a little bit over time, and some of the canvases get really hard and brittle. So if you ever look at, old canvases, in the museum, and you see them really, really hard and brittle, they had all this varnish on top. So when I use the Dharma varnish, personally, I use it on a canvas board. I don't use it on like that much on a stretched canvas because of the idea of the hardening agent. And then, like I said, afterwards you can wait, if you're using a retouch varnish. They also have something, then after that you can use a final varnish, or you can just do a final varnish when your painting is dry. Say you don't do the retouch varnish and you wait 6 months to a year for your painting to dry. You can use a final varnish when it's totally dry. Again, you can add it on top of the retouch varnish. But that's basically the kind of steps that I do when I am kind of painting. And I like the Winsor & Newton. I'm not getting paid actually from them, but I'm just saying the final varnish is kind of the best one that I recommend. The other thing is some students don't like the varnishes. Sometimes they're like, oh my gosh, that's too glossy or that's too matte. It's not what I'm looking for. So the thing is, you can mix, like a glossy and a matte together to make a satin kind of finish. It's kind of like a satin varnish, but they also do sell the satin varnish. So if you don't want to do that, but of course it's more expensive. But I like having control of my own paint, so sometimes I do make my own varnishes. The most important thing is when you're painting with oil paints, you have to have a disposable system. And I'll go into that later. Sometimes, for example, if you have a lot of linseed oil rags and you're just throwing them, in the can, they tend to get heat. They could get, start a fire. So, you can put water. I have water, and I have like a drum. Anyway, I don't have my rag soaking. and you have to have a proper way to dispose of them. The same thing with acrylics. You can't throw the medium, down the paint. You kind of have to have a sifter. If you don't have a sifter, what you can do, and I do this with my paints, is I kind of get like a plastic cup, and then I get like a cheese grater, not a cheese grater, like if you're a strainer, like a cheap strainer, and you can just cut out, you can go to a hardware store and get the strainer, and just kind of cut the circle and measure it, to the length of the jar that you're going to put the strainer in. And you can put the strainer in there and kind of place the strainer, about an inch or an inch and a half from the bottom of the jar. Therefore, when you're kind of cleaning your brushes are hitting, you see that grid, that kind of strainer, and after you washed your brushes, the paint, you'll notice, is starting to sift to the bottom. And therefore, but you have to, when you're doing that, don't scrub your brushes. Rub them very gently, and get a very, very soft kind of strainer where it doesn't affect if when you're putting it against the bristles to destroy your bristles. And you'll see the paint sitting at the bottom. The same thing with, if you're using like Turpenoid. If the Turpenoid gets really dirty after a while, it's really expensive to keep buying more Turpenoid. But if you notice, if you let the Turpenoid sit, all of the settlement and the dirt will go to the bottom after a while, and then you can just pour the clean Turpenoid, or the Turpenoid that you had used, back into another what do you call them, glass or whatever you're using, jar, and you can recycle that. I recycle my turp all the time until it gets too dirty where I can't. The other thing is, when you're cleaning your brushes, you're going to have to first take your brush and try to get out all, and I do this with acrylics too, try to get out like all the paint that you can on the rag. Then you kind of want to swirl it around in your solvent and try to do it again. So I usually have 2 jars for that, one for the first one because it gets super dirty, and the second one. But the most important thing is try to do that. Don't scrape on your brushes, but just kind of wipe them off and then swirl them, and then you can kind of get that out, and it makes your life a little bit easier when you're finally cleaning the brush. Sometimes students just use the mineral spirits, also to clean the brush. They have many cleaning solvents. If your brushes get really rough after a while, you can, put them in dish liquid, regular, dish liquid, like for washing your hands. Just kind of swirl, put a little dish liquid, swirl them in there, leave the brushes overnight and rinse them. They do sell Brush Restore again. So, again, just remember, like the Turpenoid and the Gamasol, they're both odorless mineral spirits, and they're substitutes. They act as a Turpenoid, but they are flammable. And again, your Turpenoids you do need when you're painting with the oil paints, because they're acting like the water in the acrylic paints. They kind of thin them down, where the linseed oil makes it a little bit easier to move, the brush across the canvas. So if you're going to buy a linseed oil, I recommend the best linseed oil is Stan Oil. And the reason I like it, it's like good for glazings, and you can thin it with the turpentine or the Darmar if you want. They do have sunflower oil. It's an alternative to linseed oil, but it dries very slowly, and it's a little bit of light in the color. Then they have the walnut oil. Students like that because it's natural base. They have poppy seed oil. It's a little bit lighter, but it does crack sometimes, and it dries very slowly. And then they'll have the sapphire oil, but that one, when it dries, it becomes very brittle. So that's a couple of things that you should think about if you're going to paint with oils. And I will go into a little bit more of the different mediums, like Win-Gel and Dorland's wax medium, in another video. Okay, have a great weekend.